Easy receiver, flips it to the end zone. Caught! Touchdown! Marvin Harrison Jr. making a huge impact.
Here's Edwards with the lane. Donovan Edwards down the sideline. Gets past Ransom. Donovan Edwards. Touchdown, Michigan.
Welcome into another edition of the CFF Sites Preseason Preview Series, where today we're talking Pac-12. Mike, here we are, man. Second to last show of the Power 5 conferences. Only the SEC remains. We're going to jump into the Pac-12. I know before we hit the record button, we were talking about just sort of an overview of the conference in general. What's your thought that comes to mind when discussing, or the discussion we're about to get into with Pac-12?
I think a lot of scoring, not a lot of defense played in this conference. And then just kind of the top tier players that are in this conference and particularly at the quarterback position. Obviously, I think most people's consensus number one overall pick in Caleb Williams, two other top 10 quarterbacks, Michael Penix Jr. and Bo Nix, who both coincidentally have, some question marks, some to do with coaching change, some to do with, how much upside do they have and can they replicate their stats from last year? So a lot of high-end talent, a lot of offense in this conference.
This is, we were talking before we started recording here just about the quarterbacks, and we brought up and mentioned like 5 schools themselves, either a new offensive coach, new offensive coordinator. So at least 5 different systems here among the teams in the Pac-12. When I look up and down the teams, maybe as good of fantasy talent potential as we've had in quite some time in the Pac-12. Do you agree with that? I mean, it seems to me this is a pretty strong top tier list of players that are going to be available this year.
Yeah, and I think it could grow. What makes it tough is that you get, a ton of coaching turnover in this conference. And a lot of coaching turnover leads to new perspectives, and maybe those perspectives differ from kind of what we think initially coming into the season. So it can make it tough to kind of project how these players are going to perform. But, on the surface, just a lot of talent, and we're going to talk about it up and down the conference.
Yep. Well, let's just jump into it, and let's start at the top with Arizona. Their return quarterback, Jayden de Laura, running back Michael Wiley is back. Jacob Cowing is back at receiver. McMillan is there with him as well. They bring in Montana Luminous Craig, who had a great spring game over at Colorado. He's in there. They've got the tight end, Tanner McLaughlin. There's a lot of names and a lot of targets in this offense, a lot of production returning, even though their top receiver did head over to USC, Dorian Singer. We'll save that for when we get to USC. But even with him leaving to USC, there's a lot of talent coming back here at Arizona. They should be able to put some points up on the board this year, right?
I would think. I mean, it's in my opinion, it's going to be the same offense that we saw last year, if not more explosive, even without Dorian Singer leaving. I think when we were initially doing the projections back in March, the biggest question for us was who was going to replace Dorian Singer, or, who was going to be that wide receiver 3. Initially, we thought, hey, there's nobody standing out on the roster. Maybe it's tight end Tanner McLaughlin. But, they added Montana Craig from Colorado, who parlayed his massive spring game into the transfer portal. And then he got an offer from numerous schools and wound up at Arizona. I think, you're going to see those 98 targets. Maybe some go to Tet McMillan, but I think a large portion might go to him. So I think it's just as good a wide receiver group, if not better, than we saw last year. That's good news for all 3 of them. Good news for Jayden de Laura, the quarterback, and just good for the offense as a whole.
Yeah, I think with Jacob Cowing having a 1,000-yard season this year, coming back for him, odds are pretty good that I think we could be looking at a 1,000-yard receiver once again. Will we get 2? That remains to be seen. Whether or not McMillan or Luminous Craig can fill those shoes, that remains to be seen. But you still have to like the chances of Jacob Cowing, duplicating his 1,000 yards this year, right?
I think he's one of the safest or highest floor players in college fantasy football this year. Like I said, the situation's the same. They got three really good receivers like they had last year, and he still hit 100 targets for this second consecutive season. So there's, barring injury, there's really not any reason to suspect that he won't hit that mark again. So I think just every wide receiver, running back, quarterback, I think it's easy to kind of project what we saw last year.
Yeah. Let's go over to the running back spot, though, because this one for me, we've talked about this a couple of times during the off season. Michael Wiley, running back with Arizona. He averaged, what was it? Almost 7 yards per carry last year, scored 8 touchdowns. He only averaged 10 attempts per game, 771 yards on 113 attempts. I think there's potential for him to get more work this year. What's interesting for you and I, we talk about this with a handful of players every year when we do the projections. He projected out extremely high relative to where we have him ranked. And his projections do take into account that he's going to see a heavier workload, get more touches this year, maybe a few more carries, but he figures a lot into the passing game too as a receiver out of the backfield. And given his dual threat ability, particularly in half-point and full-point PPR leagues, he's extremely valuable. And when we're doing the projections and rankings, he was the one guy that I think stood out in our conversations where, man, we don't have this guy ranked as highly as his projections are coming out. And it makes me wonder, are we a little bit lower on Wiley than we probably should, or should we be valuing him a little bit more? I throw that out there as food for thought for some of those guys that are sitting and debating on Michael Wiley's fantasy value going into 2023. I think he's one of those players that he's got a decent floor, and he might be a player that can kind of elevate above where we have him projected right now.
Maybe. We talk about this when we compile projections, is that, you look at dual threat quarterbacks and then you look at running backs who catch a lot of passes like Michael Wiley does, could easily lead all running backs in targets this year. They always seem to pop in projections. So I would favor him more so in full point PPR formats. Sure. And I would favor him preferably in best ball, because you look at last year, he was really, for most of the season, kind of 12 to 15 fantasy point per game type running back. And then he exploded 2 of those last 3 games. I think a combined 80 points in 2 of those last 3 games. So I'm kind of on the fence a little bit, but I lean more towards, I think we expect what we saw last year from him. And don't forget, Jonah Coleman's a really talented sophomore backup who did stand out again in the spring. So he could kind of figure into that. So I lean more towards, personally, Michael Wiley's maybe capped for upside. And I think we're going to see a lot of what we saw last year.
Gotcha. Let's go over to Arizona State, where things really aren't quite as settled when it comes to returning production here for Arizona State. Now, they bring in new head coach Kenny Dillingham, brings in offensive coordinator Beau Baldwin, right, who was the Eastern Washington head coach. So we're going to get a pretty open offense here. But when you look at the roster and you look at the talent on there, they've got some talent on there if you're looking at it on paper, but at quarterback, maybe still some questions. They bring in the FCS transfer Cameron Scadabo at running back. You've got DeCarlos Brooks as well. Wide receiver, some decent talent in Elijah Badger. Tight end Jalen Conyers, who may be an undervalued tight end, or he's getting a lot of attention in the offseason as maybe possibly one of the better fantasy tight end prospects for this year in 2023. When it comes to fantasy value and fantasy appeal, though, this year, Mike, when I look at this roster, when I look at the names here, none of them are really jumping off the page for me in any draft, unless I'm possibly looking at Conyers at tight end somewhere in the middle to late rounds for me. What about yourself here looking at the Sun Devils roster?
I agree. I'm kind of with you that if it's anybody, I prefer Jalen Conyers, the tight end, because I don't think during spring camp there was a player that popped more in spring camp reports than Jalen Conyers. It felt like we were seeing a headline that he was catching a touchdown or 2 touchdown passes in every single practice or scrimmage. That's how good he was during spring camp. The issue I have is that people jumped all over those reports, and they could come to fruition, right? They could turn out to be true, and he's, a top 5 tight end. I would say if you look at Dillingham's tight end production over the time that he's been an offensive coordinator, a play caller, he's never had a top 20 fantasy tight end. Mm-hmm. So you combine that statistic with question marks at quarterback. We don't know who it's going to be between Drew Pine and Trenton Bourget. And then you spoke to it, some of the receiver talent, they're really deep at receiver. Yes. Elijah Badger was really good last year. They brought in 2 transfers. They may have brought in more, but 2 primary transfers.
Melquan Stovall they have there.
Yep.
We've got Xavier Guillory projected at wide receiver 2, right? Yep. Jordan Tyson, I think they brought in.
Yeah. So that's a really talented wide receiver core combined with question marks at quarterback. So I don't know. I'm not like 100% sold that Jalen Conyers is going to live up to the top 5, top 10 kind of prediction that we have. But again, he was the best player for the Sun Devils during the spring. So that's kind of where I lean. Are you looking at the running back position, quarterback at all for you?
I thought I'd have some interest in the running back position. For me, it's just, I think I'm a pass right now. I think Scatterbo have some upside coming over from the FCS level. He's done some good things over there, but this is the comparison we're always making when we're in drafts, is that I usually find guys available in the draft that I just have a better feeling on, that I end up taking before Scatterbo, who I'm just a little bit unsure of. And also I like taking players from predicted efficient offenses, because when it comes to running back, I want somebody that's going to try to, possibly get a high volume of touches. And I just don't know if that possibility is going to exist here at Arizona State. They play in, look, we talked about it. It's going to be an offensive conference. They're going to have to keep up. I mean, there's some offenses they're going to have to play with, right? The running back's going to have to be a dual threat running back, catch the ball out of the backfield, because I see a team like Arizona State having to play and keep up with some of these other offenses in the Pac-12. And I think that favors the passing assets on this offense.
I do too. And I think that could work in Cameron Scatterbo's favor. He showed that he was a productive receiver at Sacramento State last year out of the backfield. I think the one issue there, and you mentioned to Carlos Brooks when you're teeing up Arizona State, Dillingham typically uses a running back by committee. We saw that last year with Oregon with Marquise Irving and Noah Whittington. So that's kind of a concern. On the flip side, you can wait till round 18, 19, 20 to probably draft Cameron Scatterbo right. in a draft. So not paying a premium price there. So yeah, I mean, I like the pieces. I think this is going to be a better offense than we saw last year, just because I trust Dillingham. Yeah. And I think we're kind of boasting about the talent that they brought in, right?
Yeah, it is. And I just think, to my point, when it comes in, I was trying to circle back on the names. When Scatterbo's been there, I've also had names on the board like Marquise Crosby from Louisiana Tech, right? Sean Dollars from Nevada. And I'm just higher on those 2 guys in their systems than I am in Scatterbo, who I really haven't seen at the FBS level yet. So it just comes down to a value and who I like a little bit more, considering when he's still on the board when it's my pick.
Sure.
How about Cal, Mike? They bring in Jake Spavital, the offensive coordinator. He was the Texas State, right? Coach. They bring him as offensive coordinator here at Cal. They bring in a transfer quarterback after losing Jack Plummer to Louisville. Sam Jackson comes in over from TCU. He's got some targets here to throw the ball to, and Jeremiah Hunter, Maven Anderson. They even have Brian Hightower there. So there's some potential in this offense, and we have a really good system you've got a good running back in there as well, too. And that's a topic we'll get into with Jaden Ott, who totaled 11 touchdowns last year, ran for nearly 900 yards, caught 46 passes in that offense last year. But, man, they brought in – we were talking about that. They stacked that running back room in the offseason. It makes us scratch our head a little bit. Like, man, do they not have a lot of confidence in Jaden Ott? I'm not particularly sure that that's correct. You and I talked about that. They had some injuries come up. But let's start there at running back. What are your thoughts on Jaden Ott this year after his 11 touchdown, 1,200 yard season total yards last year in this offense under Jake Spavital?
Yeah, better player than system. I like Jaden Ott, but the system being brought in with Jake Spavital, you look over the countless years that he was a head coach and an offensive coordinator, and on average, you're looking at 144 carries from the running back one, which is just, I get that he's got the receiving prowess to be really productive in a PPR format, kind of like what we spoke on with Michael Wiley previously. But, just the system kind of divvying up the carries typically, combined with all those transfers that they brought in during the offseason, and they needed depth, right? With Byron Cardwell, Justin Williams-Thomas coming in from Tennessee, like those made sense. But bringing in King Daru from Purdue, and then a San Jose State JUCO transfer late in the offseason, like that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So I'm not sure what to expect there, honestly. I mean, the reasonable explanation is that they prefer to split up the backfield, and it's going to be a running back by committee. That's just kind of what I can deduct from that those moves. Where do you stand on that? I know I don't have any shares of him this summer.
I wish I was higher on him, but I'm not, and I think that's reflective in my rankings, probably yours as well. If we were looking at last year, him coming back in the same system, what's not to like about a running back that's going to give you 40 plus catches, receptions, and nearly 1,000 yards, double-digit touchdowns? But I think you hit the nail on the head. Just a little bit of uncertainty with given Spavital's track record of historical touches by his RB1s, the depth they have in the backfield. I think bringing in Sam Jackson, also a dual threat quarterback, is going to eat some yards up and possibly some touchdowns on the ground as well. I'm curious to see. I think there's a lot of upside in this offense. I mean, Jeremiah Hunter coming back. I mean, they did lose Sturdivant to UCLA. There's some potential here in this offense, particularly with Ott in the running game and as a receiver out of the backfield, which you would figure they're going to feature his strength. But I haven't been really eyeing him in any drafts because, to my previous point, we were talking, with Arizona State running backs. At the time that Ott's on the board, there are just a few other names that I feel like I have a lot more confidence in at this point.
Yeah. I mean, I know Jake Spavital has his detractors. I mean, it was bad at Texas State, just not being able to recruit, and I don't think he saw eye to eye with the administration, so that got bad. But I another point that I wanted to make on Jaden Ott, if you remember, and I remember you weren't a fan of his, when you were doing the projections late in the year last year. Just because, and I think this speaks to that point, a third of his rushing output came in one game.
Yeah.
It was against Arizona when he had 267 yards. He didn't, from a rushing standpoint, he didn't do a whole hell of a lot else as a freshman last year. So
he ran for 100 yards in 2 of the first 4 games, 4 touchdowns in the first 4 games of the year. So when you look at his, back 2/3 of the season, 66% of the season, he only had 4 touchdowns and didn't even go over 100 yards one time. Matter of fact, he only went over 70 one time. So I mean, he started out really strong, but was now look, he did do some stuff in the passing game too. So we can't take that away, but I was kind of looking at the whole package of him being a runner, how much they were going to rely on him. He wasn't a player that they just kept feeding the ball to in the backfield. And he was very talented last year.
Yeah. And I think the other the other part of the equation too is new quarterback Sam Jackson is a dual threat runner, and probably running right now is at least his best attribute, as we saw in the spring game. So there's another part of the equation of a guy that could vulture some touchdowns in the rushing game. So I haven't drafted anyone at this point from Cal. Kind of out on the confusion with the running back group. And, you get a first-year starter quarterback. And I don't know, Jeremiah Hunter's fine. But, again, you got a first-year starter at quarterback. And I don't know. I'm just kind of out all around on this offense in year one, at least.
I've come close to drafting Jeremiah Hunter as one of my final receivers in a couple of our best ball drafts. Jaden Ott is just gone a little bit before I value him. And Sam Jackson is a real intriguing option for me that I would probably, given the depth of my roster at quarterback, would be a player if I felt good about the three quarterbacks I had in front of him. I wouldn't hesitate on pulling the trigger on him as taking a shot as my quarterback 4 or 5.
Pride of Naperville, Illinois, where I grew up.
Well, here we go, man. Colorado under Deion Sanders. Sean Lewis comes in as offensive coordinator from Kent State. And let's be honest, they flipped 252 names on this roster between now and when he took over. And there's probably another 135 bound to leave before this show gets published, right? Look, it's a whole remake over there. Shedeur Sanders, we've got projected at quarterback. He brings his son over. Alton McCaskill transferred over there from Houston just recently after we thought he was going to go back to Houston. They bring in Xavier Weaver. We have him projected at wide receiver 1 right now for the Buffs. He didn't even take part in spring practice. They've got Jimmy Horn that joined them over there as well. We've got even Travis Hunter, who's playing both sides of the ball right now. A lot of names in that Colorado offense to learn this year. Let's talk about fantasy value on Colorado, because I think you know where I'm going to go with their fantasy production. You and I have talked about it, but where are you? Are you
starting? You start.
What's that?
You start. Okay,
I
don't know exactly where you're going to go.
Okay. So here's what I'll say. I know that there's guys that like the shiny new penny. They like the shiny new toy. And I feel like Shedeur Sanders is kind of that right now. And the one thing that I feel is going to happen this year is I think he's going to have some really decent numbers, because I feel like Colorado's not going to be very good. They're going to have to play catch up in this Pac-12. They're going to have to keep up with some offenses. And I don't think they're going to be great. And my prediction is I wouldn't even be surprised if Shedeur Sanders, 2/3 of his numbers come in the second half of ball games, because maybe they're trailing 21-7, 28-14 at halftime. They're going to have to throw. I think there's just a product of who they are. He's going to end up with some decent numbers. I don't think it's going to be elite, but I do think you're going to get an ungodly amount of garbage numbers for Shedeur Sanders. And I'm a little bit up in the air, right, more so at wide receiver right now, just because I think it's going to spread all around. We didn't see Xavier Weaver in the spring. He's definitely talented enough to be their wide receiver 1. If I was going to take a stab, he would be the guy that I would go with other than Shedeur Sanders. But to that point, I say this every time, usually once or twice a year. I just am not big on drafting players when you've got to hold your breath and cross your fingers about getting garbage points in the last half of the third quarter and into the fourth quarter. Nothing worse than having a quarterback sitting on 7 or 8 points going into the fourth quarter. That's where I stand with Colorado. Not to say he's a bad pick, but I don't like him where guys are taking him. And I think you're going to have your fingers crossed for most of the year, because I think they're going to have to play from behind. And I think a lot of his numbers could be garbage numbers.
I would agree. It's unnerving, but it's also, if it's garbage time numbers, as long as he gets
garbage time numbers don't matter in college fantasy football. Right? Numbers are numbers. But you know as well as I hate sweating a fourth quarter out when my quarterback is sitting on single digits.
Plus, they're West Coast, and he's probably your last quarterback in your lineup, and you probably had a few drinks, and you'd be slamming the table if he's throwing picks in the first half. I don't know. I'm just hypothesizing now. But, yeah, I don't know. I'm looking at a draft that we're in right now, and he just went in the 15th round. It is a tight end premium draft, but, I don't have his ADP up right now. But it's not – you're not paying a steep price for Shedeur Sanders. So I really can see a path to success here for him. I haven't taken him just personally. I like to invest in players on like what we forecast as good teams. That's just kind of where I'm at. But again, it's a proven system under Sean Lewis. 26 fantasy points per game over the last 9 seasons that he's been either an offensive coordinator, head coach, or position coach. You're looking at around now. Shedeur Sanders is not a I don't know. He's a dual threat in that he can run, but he's really a pass first quarterback. But you're looking at around 100 carries for the quarterback one in Sean Lewis's system. So again, that's enticing from the quarterback position. So
his ADP, by the way, is 119. So in a standard 12 team draft, that's about 10, round 10. So
okay.
Is it safe to say that maybe his draft position is dropping a little bit since early spring, where guys jumping on him earlier?
It would take me. I don't have it. I don't have it off the top of my head. I'd have to look that up. But I don't know. I'm comfortable with him in round 10, 9, 10 like that. But I just haven't gone up to get him. That's just how I draft. So elsewhere in the offense, Xavier Weaver is going to be one player that I think we should highlight that we really need to pay attention to fall camp reports. Because every single wide receiver one under Sean Lewis has been an outside receiver. So that effectively, I know he popped in the spring, but that effectively eliminates Jimmy Horn from contending for that wide receiver one spot. For me, it's down to Travis Hunter or Xavier Weaver. Xavier Weaver is is the more proven player, I should say. And we don't know exactly what position full-time, if he plays a position full-time, that Travis Hunter is going to play. So I think Xavier Weaver is definitely a player that we need to focus on in fall camp and could be undervalued this point in the summer.
I agree. I think Xavier Weaver could be extremely undervalued. And at the same time, it's the same reason I've stayed away from him, because it feels as if he hasn't, he wasn't there in the spring. He might get there in preseason and it doesn't mesh with this coaching staff. And just like a lot of other players, he's like, I'm out of here. Right. So that's my fear with him, is that we didn't actually get to see him play. He puts on a uniform and goes through 2 weeks of practice and like, oh, I'm not a fit in this program, just like a dozen other players have. That's my fear with him. If he sticks, to your point, I think you've got a heck of a fantasy asset, garbage points or not. Xavier Weaver's going to get some points in this offense under Sean Lewis.
No doubt. Where are you at with Alt McCaskill? You drafted him at all or kind of out on this running game?
I haven't. I think I'm out on him. Had he stayed at Houston, I would have really, really have jumped all over him. But, off a year because of injury, coming back in this offense. And to that point, if we're playing, I'm going to stick with what I feel is going to play out. That's going to be my philosophy. And if I feel that Colorado is going to be a team that's playing from behind most of the year, then Alton McCaskill isn't going to be killing the clock trying to get first downs at the end of games, which means to me 15, 16 rushing attempts feels a little bit like where he's going to be every week, with possibly 2 to 5 catches out of the backfield. And at Houston, he had potential to be that 20 to 25 carry workhorse for them. So yeah, no, I don't particularly like Alton McCaskill.
No, I haven't drafted any of him either. There was an interesting article from the team beat writer that kind of did a projection almost on what percentage of carries the running backs would get in the backfield. And he gave 50% of the team's carries to Alton McCaskill, which would equate to 21 carries a game. That feels really high. We have him projected around 15 to 16 carries a game. I think just coming off injury, some of the depth that they have, they brought in Cavassier Smoke from Kentucky. Dylan Edwards, the 4-star freshman, looked really good in the spring game. So I think 15 to 16 carries feels a little bit more safe than what the team beat writer was projecting. But hey, I mean, you saw what Marquez Cooper did under Sean Lewis at Kent State, and he would average 24 carries a game. So I don't know. We'll see.
Food for thought, right?
Yep. Food for thought.
Well, let's go over to Oregon, where quarterback Bo Nix comes back, one of the top-rated fantasy quarterbacks this year. Offensive coordinator, new one, Will Stein, comes in from UTSA. So, nice track record there with what he did over at UTSA. When you look at that roster, Bucky Irvin coming back, Noah Whittingham coming back at running back, Troy Franklin, we've got pegged as, I think, a top 15, top 20 wide receiver this year for fantasy. There's a lot to like in Oregon. Bo Nix, I think it's, what you see is what you get. I think you're going to get one of the top fantasy quarterbacks. What I'm a little bit more curious of is, where do you stand with Bucky Irvin and Troy Franklin, running game, that passing game, as far as will either of those players dominate the share at their position this year?
Yeah, this is an interesting topic for Oregon, I guess, as a whole, but even with the running backs, I was trying to think of, I know they have a new offensive coordinator, Will Stein, but what's going to be different about that offense this year? Because they bring back 2/3 of their offensive production from last year. So a lot of the key pieces are back. So what potentially could be different? I personally think it's going to be a split backfield again between Marquise Irving and Noah Whittington, just because of how effective they were in their roles last year. There's not a large sample size with Will Stein, the new offensive coordinator, and how he utilizes running backs, aside from, last year, it was technically a split backfield. Like, when you look at the distribution at the end of the season between Brendan Brady and Kavorian Barnes, but he really did ride Kavorian Barnes late in the second half of last year. Does he do that with Marquise Irving? I tend to lean towards no, just because of the size difference between the two, but it's tough to tell with such a small sample size of this offensive coordinator.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, because I feel like I'm leaning on the other side of that coin. I like Bucky Irving this year. I like what he did down the stretch. He averaged a really good yards per carry, and I'm just curious if they try to be less dependent on Bo Nix in the running game. They're still going to need him. But we saw at the end of last year, when he got banged up, they were just a different offense. I don't know how serious Oregon's going to be able to make a run at the Pac-12 championship, but if they do, they're going to need him. They're going to need him healthy, right? And I just wonder, I kind of felt like after he got rolling, after the opener against Georgia last year, you kind of felt like they were fueling his Heisman talk by getting him in the end zone a little bit more. And I just wonder if that scales back a little bit and we see a little bit more in the hands of the running back this year. I tend to favor, I want, a part of me wants to have a share of Bucky Irvin this year in one of these best ball drafts before we finish. Now, on the passing game, I kind of want a share of Troy Franklin too, because we know what the wide receiver one did in Will Stein and his offense as well. And a part of me feels like that there could be some potential there. They've got 3 decent options. They got Chris Hudson. They brought in Tez Johnson as well. So Bo Nix has some options in the passing game too, but there's something inside of me that I didn't have last year at Oregon, that something makes me want to have a share of Bucky Irvin and Troy Franklin this year.
Yes, I think the offense should be just as good, if not just as good, maybe a touch lower, but they're not going to drop off dramatically. The only position that really changes much is the offensive line. They got to replace multiple starters. I think 4 starters. So that could be a hindrance if they don't meet expectations. But I thought, looking at it, the wide receivers was a very interesting topic, just because I would argue, to your point, I would argue they have 5
they
potential
do.
decent
I didn't
options.
even mention the other 2. Sure, you want to bring them up?
Trayshawn Holden from Alabama, Gary Bryant Jr. from USC. So they come in. I spoke to the short track record of offensive coordinator Will Stein. You look last year, he would have had 3 100 target receivers had DeCorian Clark stayed healthy at UTSA. Does that happen this year? With Troy Franklin, Tez Johnson, maybe Gary Bryant, whoever kind of steps up in that wide receiver room. Is it Tez Johnson or somebody else being undervalued if this passing game kind of takes off like we saw at UTSA last year?
Yeah, and I think it's not going to affect Bo Nix. I think he's going to be just as valuable this year as he was last year.
Agreed.
What about Oregon State? Let's go there. They bring in a transfer quarterback, DJU from Clemson. Damian Martinez, the running back, he's back after a really good freshman campaign last year. They've got some receivers returning. I don't know if there's really any studs that we're looking at there. But this offense, really, for me, it's going to be around Damian Martinez and that running back spot. And whether or not I do have concerns or no concerns about whether or not there are going to be some other vultures around the goal line, right? I mean, we know that they last year they used Jack Coletto around the goal line.
Is he still there? Is he still there? That is your favorite player.
I don't think he's there anymore.
Okay.
But you still got Deshaun Fenwick. DJU is a big quarterback now they can use around the goal line. I really love Damian Martinez this year. My concern with Martinez is a concern that we have with a few other players that we've probably run down on a list so far, where the yards are going to be there, the touches are going to be there, but what ultimately may determine whether or not Damian Martinez finishes as a top 20 fantasy running back may be his ability to get the ball in the end zone with frequency. That's my concern with him this year, is that, man, will we see other guys vulture touchdowns in this offense besides Damian Martinez?
That's a really good point. I think that you bring up that you bring up regarding Damian Martinez, because I kind of look at it the flip side of my reservation with Damian Martinez is he had 9 targets in the passing game last year. I think 4 receptions. Is that going to be a part of his game that he improves on? Because we spoke on it with Michael Wiley, how he pops in our projections because he's so much a big part of their
versatile. He's got the dual threat ability to catch the ball out the backfield.
He's such a big part of their passing game. Damian Martinez isn't that really, at least he hasn't proven it. So, he needs to get the yardage on the ground and he needs to find ways into the end zone. Now, the good news is this is a proven system for producing running back production. I think they have 5 seasons of 1,300 yard rushers. And this is typically a top 10 offensive line. I think for the last 2 years, they've measured out as a top 10 offensive line. So I think I consider personally Damian Martinez one of the highest floor players in college fantasy this year.
Yeah. And I think just to revisit that, catching the ball out of the backfield, can he make up some points there? That's where I have my concerns, because Deshaun Fenwick, and I think Jam Griffin all had 4 catches out of the backfield. There was no other back in that offense that had more than 4 catches out of the backfield. And what that tells me is that's more of a product of the system and not necessarily the player. So I have concerns about whether or not he'll make improvements catching the ball out of the backfield. If he does, then that offsets maybe my concern of scoring touchdowns. I just don't have the confidence that they're going to use the backs out of the backfield this year. So for me, it comes down to, hey, can Martinez hit that 11, 12 touchdown plateau? I think he's a shoo-in for 1,000 yards if healthy.
Yeah, just to speak to your point there, last 3 running back ones have not had double receptions. And then I guess you have one example, Jamar Jefferson back in 2018. He had 23 receptions on 28 targets, which solid, but not anything like a Michael Wiley or anything. But just to give some context around, I think speaks to your point too. Like, it's not getting their running backs involved in the passing game is not a priority for Oregon State and their scheme.
Yeah. Stanford, Mike. Troy Taylor comes in as head coach, probably going to run the offense. He was the Sacramento State head coach. Concerns about quarterback. They bring in Justin Lamson from Syracuse. I think that was an instant upgrade the minute he signed on the dotted line to commit to them. EJ Smith comes back at running back. I was really high on him last year. His 2022 campaign was cut extremely short due to injury. John Humphreys at receiver comes back. Ben Urasic at tight end. I think you and I both agree has potential to be one of the top tight ends in college fantasy football this year. I'll let you start with Stanford. What are your thoughts on their assets this year, knowing that they may not be or could be one of the worst teams in the Pac-12 this year?
They probably will be. I think the good good news is that, especially at the skill positions, we know exactly who they're going to get the ball to, right? As long as EJ Smith is healthy, they're going to feed him the ball both in the run and the pass, right? Wide receiver, I have no freaking clue who's going to catch the ball at receiver. Good news for Ben Urosek, right? He is the player that I've drafted the most. He's a top 5. I think I have him 3 in my tight end rankings. You look back, the new head coach, he coached at Troy Taylor at Sacramento State last year. He really featured his tight end the last few years, Marshall Martin. He had 20 touchdowns over the last 2 seasons. 18 of them were receiving, 2 rushing touchdowns as well. So I heard this on a recent podcast on Chasing a Natty. They were kind of diminishing the Sacramento State tight end, Marshall Martin, basically calling him a glorified receiver, right? He is only 6'2", 210 pounds. So I wanted to look up a statistic on Pro Football Focus. Martin at Sacramento State spent 51% of his snaps in line, right, as a potential blocker, and 48% reps in the slot as a glorified slot receiver. That same 50-50 split between inline and in the slot, Ben Urosek too. Even though they're different sizes, they were utilized in the same fashion. So, and I mentioned that Martin had rushing touchdowns the last 2 years. Ben Urosek got carries, rushing carries in the red zone as well. So I think the kind of puzzle pieces fit for Ben Urosek to have a really good year. There's really no wide receiver of interest, and hopefully we get decent quarterback production from hopefully Justin Lamson, I think, who both of us like quite a bit.
Yeah, I do. I don't know if I like him for this year for fantasy. I think he's going to be more of a 2024 prospect for me. But here's my final thoughts on Stanford's offense from a fantasy perspective. EJ Smith and Ben Urosek, I really like in PPR leagues. And, we just talked about Colorado and why I didn't like Alton McCaskill because of their ability to play from behind. And I question whether or not he's going to how often he'll get used and the rotation. This offense does feature the running back and the tight ends in the offense, in the system. So it doesn't matter the score. I feel like EJ Smith and Urosek are both going to be utilized for 4 quarters, whether they're playing from behind by 20 or whether they're in the game. That's part of the game plan. So I do like EJ Smith and Ben Urosek. And to your point, Urosek is, I think, in the top 5 tight ends for me as well. So if he's the guy that we're going out and getting in this offense.
Yep, we just need the quarterback to be adequate at best for Ben Urosek to be a top 5 tight end this year. Quick on you said EJ Smith, you like him because they're going to feature him in the passing game as well. Cam Scattybo was the running back 1 for Troy Taylor at Sacramento State. He had 30 receptions last year, and then I looked up another stat. Taylor's RB1 in 2018 had 70 receptions. Not gonna expect that out of EJ Smith, but hey, maybe it's a potential long shot outcome for his fantasy production.
That's a Mike Leach running back type reception.
Sounds like it, right?
Yeah. Well, Mike, this is where we get fun. This is where the fun turns it up a little bit. Let's get to UCLA, and quarterback battle there. Yes or no? Ethan Garbers, Dante Moore, the freshman coming in. I think you and I have faith that Moore eventually is going to be that QB1 in this offense. They bring in Sturdivant, the transfer receiver from Cal. You figure he's most likely going to nail that down, that wide receiver 1 spot. Hudson Habermale could be an undervalued tight end. We do like, Chip Kelly has a great history of utilizing and maximizing that tight end position. But really, the conversation needs to start at running back, because running back 1 for Chip Kelly, even though 2 could be relevant in this offense, if Carson Steele or TJ Harden nail down that running back 1 spot, boy, if we knew that right now, we'd probably have one of those guys ranked within the top 12 to 15. But are they that this year? That's the question, because my I lean on the side, and I'm on the Carson Steele side. I think that Carson Steele is going to nail down that job. I'm drafting him as if he is, because I love the upside potential in that offense. But it is debatable. There are others that think that TJ Harden could be. Where do you stand?
I don't have an opinion right now for like who's the better player between the two with Steele and TJ Harden. I'm kind of basing it on what the reporters are reporting in the spring as of now, whether that information's trustworthy or not. But I think it's funny. I think we're going to find out a lot about the UCLA beat reporters and how accurate or inaccurate they are based upon how this running back position transpires. I think you stack them. You can probably get TJ Harden right now about 5 to 6 rounds after Carson Steele. So I think it's worth stacking them at this point, because this is typically a run first offense with Chip Kelly. And I think breaking in a new starting quarterback, whether it be Ethan Garbers or the freshman Dante Moore, be even more run heavy. My comparison as of now for this situation is what we saw 2 years ago. If you remember, with Zach Charbonnet and Britton Brown. Charbonnet had around 200 carries. Britton Brown had a little bit over 100. How this situation plays out, whichever player wins out, I think you're going to see that sort of distribution between the two, which again could turn into both being valuable. Could turn into, if both are healthy, could turn into kind of a messy situation in redraft, right? Who's going to be the preferred back between the two on a week-to-week basis? So I like them in best ball personally right now, despite what we've seen from a Chip Kelly running back one over the years. And I would try and stack that situation. Where are you at?
So I like Carson Steele. I've made no, that's where I stand. I'm standing on the Carson Steele hill. Now, let's just talk about this too, with stacking running backs in best ball too. Let's talk about strategy just real quick while we're there. I like Carson Steele, and I think if you get him early, if you feel like he's going to be the guy, you get him. And the good thing about stacking the UCLA backs is once when you take Steele off the market, you pretty much scare everyone else off of TJ Harden for at least another couple of rounds. So you don't have to stack these guys. And a lot of these guys that you're taking in drafts back to back, right? Unless you're looking at guys like Blake Corum and Donovan Edwards from Michigan. When you get a Carson Steele on your roster, you pretty much are locking down both backs as long as you get Harden within reasonable distance, 3-4 rounds later. You don't have to get them right away. So I think you bring up a really good point. You stack these guys, you get whichever one you feel like you really like, unless somebody really loves the other guy. You can usually scare everyone else off 2 or 3 rounds from drafting them, because everyone else is afraid of what you are, that they're going to draft and waste the roster spot on someone else. Now, in redrafts, it's a little bit of a different approach because you get to throw the guy back in the pool and you get to cut him. But in best buy drafts, stacking them, I think, is wise, and you don't necessarily have to do it back to back.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and we could discuss it at length in another podcast. But yeah, like Blake Corum and Donovan Edwards, Ashton Genty and George Holani, I think are two that come up right off top of mind. Maybe Katron Allen and Nick Singleton, that like you kind of want to grab them closer together, maybe a 2 to 3 round split. I mentioned like a 5 to 6 round split right now was what I'm seeing in drafts between TJ Harden and Carson Steele. And then you get other situations like we've spoken about Trayshawn Ward and DJ Giddens, or a Josh McCray and Reggie Love, where there's just you can wait 10 to 15 rounds and get a Reggie Love at the end of the draft, because nobody believes in his talent, but there are believers in TJ Harden. They're believers in either his talent or the reports. And you would want to snatch those two up if you're interested in drafting them somewhat reasonably close together.
What about the quarterback spot, Mike? Dante Moore, is your feeling? I know where your feeling is. I think you and I both agree. Eventually, he is going to be the starting quarterback. I think the biggest question that most people want to know is, where do we feel who's going to be the starting quarterback when they take the field in week 1? That I'm a little bit uncertain of right now. But the one thing that I do feel confident is that when I look at the schedule, Coastal Carolina at San Diego State, NC Central at Utah, and then they're off, and then they start the rest of their Pac-12 play. I feel that if Moore is not the starting quarterback by that week 5, following that, that week 5 or whatever, the week they come off the bye in week 5, starting in week 6, if he's not the quarterback by then, I feel like that's the spot where we're going to start seeing him. So I think that he will be the quarterback for 2/3 of the season if he isn't the starter come week 1. I'm not sure, but that's my feeling. I just feel like his talent's going to win out in this quarterback battle.
That's interesting, just their opening week schedule. Now, they're going to be favored probably by double digits against Coastal Carolina and San Diego State. I'm not a handicapper, but that would be my guess. But those aren't games that UCLA can just cakewalk over. So,
remember they almost got upended by South Alabama last year, right? So
wasn't Bowling Green close to it? Maybe Bowling Green was
hung with them
for a
half.
Yeah. I don't know if Ethan Garber starts. Gets the first snap, he's going to have to perform, especially, you got an experienced Coastal Carolina offense, so he's going to have to perform. And I would imagine that if he doesn't, that Chip Kelly would be kind of have a quick trigger and put Dante Moore in the game if those games are in doubt at any point.
Well, the good thing is what I love about Chip Kelly, and fantasy owners should love this too. He doesn't take his foot off the gas. He is 4 quarters. And, I can see, when you look at Coastal, San Diego State, and NC Central, particularly that game against NC Central, you're probably going to see both guys play if they're healthy, because they're going to try to run up the score. They're not going to take their foot off the gas for sure.
Yeah. You love them for keeping the pedal to the metal, and you hate them for providing absolutely zero injury reports.
No doubt. Well, USC, it was inevitable we were going to get here with quarterback Caleb Williams, the Heisman Trophy winner, arguably the first pick in most college fantasy football drafts. You make a case for other players depending on the format. But Caleb Williams, number 1 in ADP right now, number 1 in most leagues. So, Mike, there's really no debate about Caleb Williams. There's no sense of even wasting a lot of time and discussing and selling anybody on Caleb Williams. But there are other questions, like who's he going to be throwing the ball to? Who's going to get the majority of targets? You've got Marshawn Lloyd coming in from South Carolina after Austin Jones was serviceable last year. And you've got some that would debate, given what Dorian Singer did at Arizona, that he may be all-world at USC. You and I are on the other side of that coin. We're tempering expectations with all the other players in this offense right now besides Caleb Williams. Do you want to go a little bit into that in regards to Dorian Singer? You've got Taj Washington there. You've got Mario Williams back, Brendan Rice, Michael Jackson. They've got a lot of talented receivers. That's not even mentioning the freshmen that came in. They've got a really good freshman tight end that we're projecting there as a starter. A lot of targets for Caleb Williams to get the ball to.
Yeah, where do we start with USC? I just want to make one point on Caleb Williams. He is QB1. He should probably be, overall player 1-1. He's got 2 buys, right? If you make it to your championship game, he's off week 13. So I would say my only speaking point to Caleb Williams is that you pair him with a quarterback that's got a really easy matchup in week 13. I was just looking if you get a chance to pair him with Siobhan Cordero, who plays at UNLV, or a Curtis Rourke, maybe if you're lucky enough, he plays at Akron in that final week. That's my best suggestion for Caleb Williams, is to pair him with one of those quarterbacks who's got a cakewalk in week 13. Start with receivers. I mean, we're still projecting Dorian Singer as wide receiver 1. But I'm glad to see his ADP fell over the course of the offseason. He was wide receiver 11 back in February when we started all these best ball drafts, and he was going, second, third round on average right at the beginning. Now you can get him much later on. I think he's fallen to wide receiver 20, which I'm still personally not drafting him. But I can see the argument in the path, just because we know how good this offense is going to be. You look back, I mean, Jordan Addison wasn't going to hit 100 targets last year, and he was the former Blitnikoff Award winner. I think you would agree.
Yep.
Jordan Addison is a far superior player than Dorian Singer. And just look at the way Lincoln Riley is just spread around the ball the last few years, even dating back to Oklahoma. So I'm for taking shots on a player on USC, a receiver later in drafts than reaching for Dorian Singer.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not going to add much more onto the wide receivers because for me, I think where I'm more willing to take a shot is running back. I know I mentioned this to you in the spring. I think when you bring in a player and caliber of Marshawn Lloyd, I think you're bringing him in there to really take some of that heat and attention off of Caleb Williams. I really like Marshawn Lloyd this year. I'm worried if I'm just not higher on him than I should be, but you and I play the numbers sometimes. We play historical trends sometimes. And Lincoln Riley does have a lot of he's shown that he can rotate those running backs through the system over there. That is a little bit of more of my concern with Marshawn Lloyd, but I love his upside in this USC offense. They should score a ton of points. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if they hit the 50-point mark, 4 or 5 times this year.
Oh yeah, it's just it's a matter of who's starting. We both have Marshawn Lloyd projected as running back 1, and I think we would both agree that he's the far superior player to Austin Jones now. But Austin Jones was decent at the end of the year when he came in for Travis Dye, right? He had a couple 100-yard games, one of them against Notre Dame, which is a good opponent. So he proved plenty capable at the end of last season. So it's a matter of who's going to be that running back 1, still up in the air technically. But yeah, it's a position of high priority. You have 5 1,000-yard rushers in the last 8 seasons under Lincoln Riley. You have 5 double-digit touchdown seasons from the running back 1 in the last 8 years. You're averaging around 18 fantasy points per game.
Well, he can spread it around a lot, right? I mean, in addition to Jones, you've got Raleek Brown back as well. So, I mean, you've got playmakers there in that offense. And so the question just becomes, who other than Caleb Williams in this offense is going to be that consistent fantasy producer week in and week out? And to your point, going back to Dorian Singer, like if Jordan Addison wasn't that guy last year, what makes us think Dorian Singer is going to be any better than Jordan Addison last year?
I would say whoever wins the running back 1 battle will be the most consistent option next to Caleb Williams.
Would agree. Utah, Mike. Cam Rising. We'll get into him as soon as we finish this rundown. Solid quarterback, made some strides last year, got injured at the end of last year. So we're going to touch on that a little bit. At the receiver spot, you've got experience coming back. Devon Vele, Money Parks. They bring in Micah Pittman, who transferred in from Florida State. Brant Keithy back at tight end. They've got Thomas Yasmin. Did they add another tight end there?
They added a receiver too, Emery Simmons from Indiana. They might have added tight end. I can't remember. They have a boatload of them.
Yeah. So, but it all, I think for you, starts and stops with that running back position, DeQuindon Jackson. You're really high on him this year. So I'm going to give you the floor on DeQuindon Jackson and sell him in the first round for everybody.
Yeah. I'll say, what did you say? First round?
Right. You're going to sell him into the first round, right?
I'm not going to sell him into the first round, but I've been taking.
So the first pick of the second round, you're going to sell them on.
Maybe the last pick in the second round.
All right.
Look, you have the track record for 12 1,000-yard seasons in the last 19 years under Kyle Whittingham. So this is the money position in the Utah offense. People are tentative because of how messy last year was. Tavion Thomas was a complete bust. You bring back Micah Bernard. He's a third down back, whatever. And then Jalen Glover, I guess, is still around too. People were really high on him, including me last year. 4-star talent. I think he's still going to be good down the road. But this is what I try and tell people. Look, there's analysts and then there's people that have their their opinions on players and so forth. But at some point you have to start listening and prioritizing to the messaging of the coaches and the beat writers. And if they're saying the same thing, then I'm going to lean in that direction. And the consistent messaging was that they were preparing Ja'Quinden Jackson for a workhorse role. That's what I'm expecting in 2023, and that's why I've been drafting him in the late second and now in the third round. Like, if he's going to get 230 carries, like, I want that. Right?
I agree.
Especially
Look,
the offense.
You have him, I think, in your latest rankings. I think you have him at 8.
Yep.
I have him at 12. Not much difference. I actually like your spot a little. I do. I have him at 12, but to your point, his upside in this offense, he does have the potential to finish the year as a top 5 fantasy back if he gets that feature on every first and second down that we hoping that he does, because he's going to get the ball at the goal line. There's just no doubt about it.
There's no doubt about it, in my opinion. I think two things also working for him. One, he is just learning the position, right? He's a former quarterback coming out of high school, so he's still growing into the position. And then 2, like in the spring game, they were utilizing him in the passing game as well a little bit. So I think if he adds that to his repertoire, like, I think sky's the limit for him. Look, 6 of the last 9 running back ones under Whittingham have hit 200 carries in the season. So there's a better chance than not that he's going to get 200 carries this season, which sets up well for a top 10 fantasy running back.
Before we get to Cam Rising, let's just touch on tight end real quick. Brant Kuithe comes back. This Utah offense has shown that it can produce 2 fantasy options at tight end, and folks should definitely have Thomas Yasmin on their draft radar as well, that play in leagues that require tight ends, correct?
Yeah. I don't have a ton of strong opinions on either player. I think just kind of stay tuned. I mean, Brant Kuithe had a serious leg injury last year, so I would just stay tuned to kind of his injury status, and that could boost up Thomas Yasmin. But again, it's a stackable situation at tight end where we've seen in the past, similar to Iowa, multiple tight ends can be productive in this offense. I think the question that comes in there is Cam Rising's health, and we spoke to it too, the increased depth at wide receiver. They have a lot of talented options at wide receiver, in my opinion.
You know, what's interesting is talking about stacking tight end. I could make an argument that Utah tight end stack would be one of the top 10 stacks that I would do in all of college fantasy football, because of their ability to produce 2 fantasy tight ends if need be. And if one of those guys go down there, it doesn't matter. You've got the other starter. You're going to have a top flight fantasy tight end on your roster, even if one of them stays healthy. So,
yeah, I mean, it's combined over 110 targets between the last 2 years. So again, both tight end 1 and tight end 2 can be very good in this offense.
And then we can't move on without touching on quarterback, because Cam Rising did have a significant injury at the end of last year. I know you and I had some conversations about this in the spring, trying to temper expectations on whether or not he would be back to start the year. It seems like reading that he is ahead of schedule. Is it coach speak? I don't know. Whittingham may have, a history of kind of being mum on that type of information. Still something that fantasy owners should be wary about going into drafts, because until we see Rising out there in preseason camp taking snaps, it's still going to be a little bit of a risk. So I advise not overreaching for him. I think I took him as a quarterback 4 or 5 in one of our best ball drafts, and it's still risky because it was still early. Hopefully we get some news coming up as we get a little bit closer to camp, or at least see him practicing.
Yeah, I wish he was healthy, because especially from a redraft standpoint, he was really good last year. He had 20 more fantasy points in 10 of 13 games last year. So that is a quarterback that you can just bank on week in and week out, that giving you really solid production, probably as a QB2, not a QB1. But yeah, we'll see. We'll see if Whittingham's coaching quotes come to fruition, that he's, on track to play, because DFS players in particular don't trust Kyle Whittingham at all with the coach speak that he typically feeds us. He lied about, I think it was Tavion Thomas. I don't remember the exact situation. I think it was Tavion Thomas last year that, I don't know, he was, they said he was all set to play the entire week. He was dressed out, and then he didn't see a single snap. So I don't know. Don't trust what Kyle Whittingham says is my best advice there.
All right, Mike, let's go over to the state of Washington, and let's start with the University of Washington. Like, what's not to like about this offense? You got Michael Penix Jr. coming back at quarterback, receiver, Rome Odunze coming back, Jalen McMillan coming back, Jalen Polk at wide receiver 3 coming back, Jake Westover at tight end. I mean, you name it. I think they're top 5 or 6 pass catchers from last year. All are coming back. You got Cameron Davis in the backfield. They bring in Dylan Johnson, the transfer from Mississippi State. He comes in this year. So, I mean, that Washington offense is loaded on paper. They're loaded with experience. Wayne Tualapapa was the leading rusher for them last year. They bring in Dylan Johnson, who has the ability to run and catch the ball out of the backfield as he did at Mississippi State with Mike Leach. A lot to love about Washington's offense. Michael Penix, top 10 fantasy quarterback. And we mentioned this when we recorded the Big Ten show, Washington, just like Ohio State, with potentially 2 top 10 fantasy receivers on their roster in this offense.
Yeah, it's kind of the same conversation for me with Oregon. Like, what you're bringing back essentially everybody except for starters along the offensive line. What could be different this year than what we saw last year? I was looking at Michael Penix Jr. I mean, it was the best fantasy performance ever of a Kalen DeBoer quarterback in college fantasy last year with Michael Penix. It was the highest passer rate that we've ever seen under DeBoer last season. Makes sense with the surrounding pieces, but maybe there, if it's the highest ever, maybe there's a chance for regression there if the running game is good. I don't know. I just
4,600 yards last year, 31 touchdown passes. Those are going to be tough numbers to really duplicate. I actually think he can duplicate and get higher touchdown passes. Maybe not the yardage, but I'm okay with that, man. If he could hit that 35, 36 passing touchdowns, then I think you could be looking at a better statistical season this year.
The one thing for me is that he needs to hit that because he's not going to run the football at all. Right. So he has to replicate last year and even surpass to kind of match his ADP where he's going in the first round or early second round in most drafts. So, but I think it's a very safe, you don't usually use the term safe in terms of like first and second round guys, but I think he's a very safe quarterback that all those pieces at wide receiver, it's really hard to fail with a Jalen McMillan and a Rome Odunze at wide receiver.
Yeah, I agree. With Penix, we're not looking at one of those quarterbacks that are going to give you those 50-point performances like a John Rice Plumlee can from any given week, but you're also looking at a higher floor and I think that's why he's ranked as high. We talk about the dual threat ability, and if you don't have it, your numbers have to really go through the roof. But when you look at Penix, if he's going to give you 4,000 yards and possibly 36 touchdowns, what that tells you is that he's giving you 300 yards, 3 passing touchdowns on average every week. You'll take that consistency as a floor any day of the week, even if you're using him as your quarterback 1, you hit on that quarterback 2, and you've got two really consistent quarterback options there. Even though he doesn't have that dual threat upside, you're going to get the consistency from him passing in that DeBoer offense week to week.
Yeah. Yep. You just, you're just, there's not the upside, in my opinion, he's not going to run for any, like 2 touchdowns. What did he do? 3 touchdowns last year on 40 some carries. So in my opinion, he has to replicate his passing performances from last year to kind of match his ADP and where he's going in drafts.
And I would argue, I think he's going to go higher passing touchdowns this year. And for that reason, I hope he does, because Odunze and McMillan last year were 1,000-yard receivers. Neither one of those guys hit double-digit touchdowns. So if we can see Penix and that offense really improve the passing touchdown numbers, then you possibly are looking at now 2 receivers with 1,000-yard double-digit touchdown years, and then that would justify their ranking within the top 10 this year in the preseason. So I'm hopeful that Penix can really go beyond, push that 40 touchdown pass number. And I think that favors then Odunze and McMillan really getting over that double-digit touchdown plateau.
Yeah. And there's nothing, I'm looking at it now. There's nothing in the schedule that really scares you off, right? Boise State, Tulsa, and Michigan State in the non-conference, and then you get into Pac-12 play. So there's no game in where you're like, I have to sit Michael Penix Jr. in your lineup.
Last team, Washington State. They lose offensive coordinator Eric Morris. He goes back to North Texas, right? But Cameron Ward is back at quarterback. You know, there's a lot to like here with Washington State with the experience that they have coming back. Where you know, I think we kind of start and stop with him. There's going to be some questions with Nakia Watson at running back. DT Sheffield was the talk of spring at receiver. They've got Joshua Kelly now there. Kyle Williams, Lincoln Victor comes back as well. There's still a bevy of receivers there at Cameron Ward's disposal. I would argue that Washington State had a better year than I anticipated last year, and it wasn't because of the offense. I thought it seemed like everybody thought the offense was going to explode and carry them. That wasn't the case. Their defense actually kept them in a lot of games last year, and Cameron Ward was just, a serviceable fantasy quarterback, arguable, probably a good best ball candidate last year. He had his ups, he had his downs. Could we expect more from Cameron Ward in year number 2, even with a new offensive coordinator this year? Where do you stand on Ward and possibly Nakia Watson duplicating his production from last year?
I'm out on Nakia Watson. I think you spoke about the defense for Washington State. I also think Nakia Watson was just a really pleasant surprise for Washington State last year. But he's one of the top regression candidates for me. Just with the new system being brought in, like it's Ben Arbuckle, the former Western Kentucky offensive coordinator. Last year, the running back one had 116 carries. Like that's just not going to do it for you unless they're getting, 70, 80 targets in the passing game, which Nakia Watson's not going to get. Plus, they like their running back too, Jalen Jenkins. So I'm kind of out on Nakia Watson, even though he was very solid last year. I'm higher than you, I believe, on Cameron Ward. I like the change in at offensive coordinator. And I think I told you this with me and ranking quarterbacks. I want a guy that's either going to rush for 500 yards or he's going to throw for 4,000 or throw for 4,000 yards. And I think Cameron Ward has that upside as a 4,000 yard passer in the system. I was looking up a statistic. One of the things that they were working on, Ben Arbuckle and Ward in the spring, was his downfield passing. Last year, he completed 11 of 43 attempts. So like 27% of passes beyond 20 yards. In comparison, in the same, or in what is now the same system under Arbuckle, Austin Reed completed 43% of his deep shots beyond 20 yards. So 45 completions on 106 attempts. I think not only the percentage of passes that he completed beyond 20 yards, but also he attempted 106 passing attempts versus just 43 for Cameron Ward. So I think you're going to see more deep shots lead to more yards and potentially lead to more touchdowns. So that's kind of where I'm at with Cameron Ward. I like the upside of a potential 4,000 yard passer, even maybe league winner, if everything hits the way, we saw last year with Austin Reed and Arbuckle.
So then if we're going to take that investment, we've got to be undervaluing some receivers here then that makes Sheffield, Kelly, Williams. There's got to be some value there at receiver. So I know in the drafts we've done, DT Sheffield is going before any other target, but you can get a lot of those other guys anytime you want.
That's a great point. Anytime you want. I'm going to take draft that I'm doing now. I think I'm going to take Josh Kelly with my last round pick. He's transfer from Fresno State. I think he was kind of that second guy that kind of showed out in the spring, aside from DT Sheffield. We like to favor the slot receivers in this scheme. Outside receiver last year for Western Kentucky had 100 plus targets. David Davis was the wide receiver 3, and he had 98 targets. So it's very feasible, while we focus on the slot receivers, that the outside guy could be fantasy relevant. And I think Josh Kelly is going to be that guy, which speaks to your point, you can get for free in most drafts.
Well, what's interesting is that we've got a best ball draft coming up. That draft's going to be done before this show even gets published. I might even have some fun and snipe Cameron Ward and Josh Kelly from you in that draft, just so I can get a nice friendly text from you on the side.
Well, just as long as you don't snipe DT Sheffield from me, because that he is my favorite player.
He's strictly value for me, and it's just, you know, if I can get to it, like, he's a guy that I like too. I think, you know, I like him too, but you do see him a lot higher on Ward than I am, and you've kind of probably talked me up a little bit on Ward. So, you know, that's what I love about doing these shows. You know, we sit and have tons of conversations, but the way that you sell a player sometimes, you might have just sold me a little bit more on Ward than I was. So I got to take that into consideration.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's an improved receiver core that he's working with too. So I think better coaching plus a better receiver core this year, especially if a guy like DT Sheffield hits. And, you know, I don't want to say league winner, but, you know, I mean, hell, Austin Reed
already did. You already said league winner for Cam Ward.
Austin Reed was a league winner in this offense last year. So I
can't wait till somebody puts, I like Cameron Ward league winner in the Discord because of this show. And they saw you say that.
Probably see you, Tiger, one of those guys.
Well, look, Mike, any final thoughts on the Pac-12? Anything that we missed that you want to go back, put a bow on, that you might want to bring up, or did we cover it all, man?
This is one of our longer shows. I think we covered it all too. And this is 12 teams, not 14 teams. Yeah. We'll probably surpass it with the SEC in your territory.
We'll give the SEC fans what they want. A lot of airtime.
Yeah.
All right, brother. Well, look, that's going to do it for this Pac-12 show. We've got 9 down, 1 more left to go in the CFF Sites Preseason Preview Series. For my partner, Mike Bainbridge, I'm Joe DeSalvo. That's it for this show. We'll see you when we're talking SEC. Till then, next guys.